which comes in handy.
And just while Bjorn's doing that, do we have any questions from the floor? Do I see any hands?
When he's pulling that branch down, when you're pulling that branch down, are you using the force with your hand and then just tightening up the wire with the gap you've sort of made there?
Yes, yeah. So what I'm doing as I push this down, I'm actually typically I use my pinky finger and my ring finger here and kind of use those to create the fulcrum at the base, and then I use my thumb to push down at the top and then pull with the other hand. Right, so I'm feeling in this area to feel if it's starting to crack or tear, listening for it as well. But yes, I'm pushing down on the branch, pulling on the wire at the same time, so it's twisting down the length of that wire, so hopefully it won't snap.
Great question. Thank you, David. Question from this side of the floor. It's been a bit quiet over here. Here we go.
A few people these days are just using cable ties as a simple guy wire. What are your thoughts on using them?
I've never used them myself. As long as they hold, I don't see any problem using the cable ties. But I've never used it myself. Now, there are some branches on here where the needles are just too long. And like I said, I want to create kind of a nice design for the demo. So we are actually going to cut a few of the needles on this tree. So for example, this branch back here, a lot of these needles, like this cluster here and that one there, they're just too long. They stick out too far in the design. So very simple process, just like a haircut. You go back to the inside of the branch, you pull out to the end, like so, and we just cut it back to kind of an average needle length that you see on the rest of the tree. I wouldn't want to do that on every single branch, but if there are a few that are sticking out here and there, it's not that big a deal. It gives us a nice look for the demonstration here. The only other time I would do something like that would be in prepping the tree for an exhibition. So if you ever go to the Kokufu or any major exhibition in Japan, look at some of the pines. Take a look at the needles. 90% of the needles are going to be, just the right size. The tree should have been maintained properly and balanced properly leading up to the show. But inevitably, you're going to have a few that are going to be out of proportion with the rest of the tree. Typically, what happens is like the day before the show, those needles will get cut, right? So you go in and you take a look, you might see a few here and there where the needles have actually been cut through.
And Bjorn, will those needles brown off where they're cut?
Yeah, if you use really sharp scissors, they shouldn't brown too much. You might get a little browning right at the very tip. You can kind of hedge against that to some degree, though, by misting the foliage for a few days. But inevitably, they will turn slightly brown. But you want to make sure you're using nice sharp scissors for that process.
And over time, will they repair themselves?
So the needles on this tree, on a black pine, are going to last for a year, basically. So whatever needles we cut off now, by the time we get to fall of this year, those needles will start to fall off, and the new needles will have replaced them by that point. So whatever I've cut on here should only be on here until, I guess, probably about 6 months from now, 8 months from now. You got any other questions?
Just quietly observing for the moment, I think, Bjorn.
Right. So I'm trying to create that picture frame that we talked about earlier with the foliage, right? Kind of drawing your eye back into this area. So this branch that I had around to the rear, I brought it around to the front and actually split this here, taking one piece towards the rear to kind of fill some visual space there. That should start to draw your eye into this area here.
And Bjorn, just as you're wiring that there and shaping it up, how many countries have you travelled to teach bonsai?
Probably 35 or 40, I would say. So I usually, every year, travel to probably 14 or 15 different countries. A lot of those are repeats from previous years, but I always add a few every year to that. And right now I travel about 250 days out of the year. So that will... I will stop doing so much traveling here in the not too distant future once we get the nursery set up.
So in your travels there, you've obviously worked on some great private collections. You don't need to name names, but any stories to share about some private collections that you've come across?
Yeah, so I was recently in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, actually. That was the most interesting experience that I've had so far. He's a relatively wealthy fellow over there, but his idea was to bring in trees from Japan and try to keep them alive in the Abu Dhabi heat. So I was there in June of this year, just about a month ago, I guess. The daytime temperatures were getting up to, I think, 48 degrees. And now, in July, those temperatures are up to 55 degrees by the afternoon. And surprisingly, they actually have really high humidity there. So in the afternoons, about 5 o'clock, it gets up to 85–90% humidity with that heat. It's miserable. So a majority of the trees that this fella is wanting to bring in, though, they're really all temperate trees. So we're trying to figure out how to keep those trees alive right now, which has been a very big challenge. Yes, yeah, shade for those trees. We're in the process of building a very specialized greenhouse for those trees to simulate the Japanese seasons. Yeah, that has been a big challenge. Yes, very, very big challenge. I will surprise even myself if we can make that work. So. But they've got a team of scientists on the project to figure out how to do this. Yeah.
And Bjorn, we were speaking with the VTPs before about advice for beginners.
Yes.
So for you, if you were to start out again, what advice would you impart to those of us that are only a couple of years in?
Sure, yeah. I think the advice that was given by the guys was really good advice, particularly the advice about not buying too much, not diving in head first and buying one of everything, focusing more on quality rather than quantity. You got to kind of experiment at the beginning to figure out what species you like, kind of stylistically what you're interested in. But you can do that in a discerning way. You don't have to buy one of everything to make that happen. So I would say that would probably be my biggest piece of advice, is to not go overboard right from the start, because you end up spending all your time working on stuff that's just not going to be great, and you might have 2 or 3 really great trees in your collection that end up going to crap because you don't have enough time to dedicate to those. So that would probably be the biggest thing, I would say.
A great question from the back of the room here is, what is the most expensive tree that you've ever worked on?
Let's see. Probably about $250,000, I would say. We have a few trees at Fujikawa-san's nursery that are 6-figure trees. One of them is a very famous tree named Hakuryu, which translates to white dragon. It was a name, I think, given by the Japanese Bonsai Association for that particular tree. So I think I actually did a video on it a while back. But when I first started my apprenticeship, Fujikawa-san told me that when I got to the end of my apprenticeship, if I had finished and done well, he would allow me to wire that tree. So at the very end, he allowed me to wire that tree, which is very cool. So that tree took 70 hours to wire, though. It was a lot of work. And speaking of that tree, a lot of Japanese bonsai professionals, they chain smoke. They constantly smoke. So I asked Fujikawa-san, why do so many of you guys smoke? He walked me outside to that $250,000 tree, stood in front of it with a pair of scissors, sucked in on a cigarette, cut off a branch, and then blew out with a cigarette and said, "That's why I smoke." So, yeah, it calms him down, I guess, when he's cutting off $10,000 worth of foliage on a tree. So this tree will probably require some grafting at some point to fill in some space, particularly up here at the apex. I'll explain exactly where we're going to do that here in just a second. So as Joe was mentioning earlier, the apex is always the hardest part to successfully create, particularly if you don't have a ton of foliage to work with up at the top. Really one of the main reasons why it's so difficult to make a nice apex is because the goal is, in most cases, to create kind of a rounded dome-like top. But what ends up happening is you end up creating kind of a helmet type look to the tree. With a tree like this, where we have very little foliage at the top, very few branches to work with, it's kind of hard to show exactly how we can hedge against that. But for the most part, what it involves is, if you create that kind of rounded dome top to the tree, the tendency is to create a flat line on the bottom and then the rounded dome at the top. That's what gives it a helmet look, and it doesn't look right. So what you want to do, instead of creating that one flat line at the bottom, you want to create multiple lines, very small lines that are broken up, and then the further you get into the apex, you create smaller and smaller lines, but the totality of the apex is rounded at the top. Again, with this tree, I'm not going to be able to show it because we don't have a lot of foliage to work with. Yes? Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And as a matter of fact, the growth that comes out this year, so some of this that will elongate, maybe strategically you pick a few here and there that you don't decandle this year with the intention of next late winter, early spring, using those as eisei-en grafts on different parts of the tree.
Bjorn, I know like trees that go to the Kokufuten and stuff, they're clients' trees that professionals often work on.
Yes.
I was recently in Japan at Kimura-san's nursery, and he had an enormous pine. It was a couple of metres across, but I had to go through a door that was 80 centimetres wide, and it was 30 stories up. And I was watching him for a while, and I'm trying to figure out what he was doing, and they tipped it one way and the other way, and then he's like, just give me a saw, I'm chopping the roots off. And he pretty much chopped it in half. And it must have been a couple of 100-year-old tree. This wasn't a small tree. How much, as a professional, do you kind of allow, well, a client's bought this tree, it doesn't matter how much it costs, he wants it in his apartment. I'll butcher it for him because he's paying the bills. And how much do you allow to say, well, you're the professional, you do what's best, and I'll just take what you give me?
Sure, yeah. I'm not sure what the circumstances would have been in that case and why he would have done it that way. Maybe he just needed to eat a sandwich or something. He was a bit hangry. I don't know. So, but no, that's not normal to do something like that. So, it depends on the client as well. So, in most cases, when you have a tree like that, where you've got to get it through a small door, what we would do if it was a really important tree and we really needed to get it to a certain area, we'd probably rent a crane and lift it up and over, or put it on top of the roof. So I'm not quite sure why he would have done it like that in that particular instance, but that's not normal.
And Bjorn, a good question from Mark on the same line as the question of the most expensive tree. What is the oldest tree that you've had the pleasure of working on?
So in the States right now, there's a new species of juniper that's being collected down in New Mexico called the one-seed juniper, Juniperus monosperma. Some of the trees that are being collected and that I've been working on recently are upwards of 1,200 to 1,400 years old off of this property. So they typically grow about 2 centimeters per 85 years. And some of the trunks on these trees are that big around. They're huge trees. Maybe later at the dinner tonight, if you guys want to see, I'll show you some photos of some of these trees. But they're just spectacular pieces of material. But yeah, some are 1,000 to 1,400 years old, somewhere in that range, just based on the growth habits of that species in that area. Yeah, so that's one issue with that particular species. One reason why they haven't become popular until recently is because they're incredibly difficult to collect because they grow in the desert. So they end up putting out a taproot that can go 10, 15 meters down underground. But on this particular property where we're collecting these trees, they actually sit more in pockets. So we can go in and actually scoop the whole root ball out with some of those big excavators that you use to move big trees. And then we'll put them on a a bobcat and wheel them out of the mountains on those. Some of these trees with the root balls, though, they weigh a ton, like literally a ton, to get them out of the mountains with that root ball on them intact. And the success rate with those is about 90% at this point, which is great. This is all on private property. So this property was purchased by someone. It's 365 acres purchased with the sole purpose of collecting the trees off the property. So, yeah. So no, there's no conservation with those trees. Now, if it's public property, public land, then yeah, you'd have to get special permission. And this property butts up against what's called BLM land, the Bureau of Land Management. So if you wanted to collect off of that property, you'd have to get special permits for it. But those aren't hard to get in the U.S. It depends on the tree. Most of the large ones, it takes about 2 days.
So just to clarify that question,
Yes.
that was how long does it take to get a tree like that out of the ground?
Yeah, about a 2-day process for a lot of those trees. Certain trees, yeah. If they feel like there's not going to be enough rootage or the taproot goes down too far, we'll prepare the trees by digging around them, putting new soil in, fertilizing right at the base of the tree, and then waiting a year or 2 to dig the trees out. So it all just depends on the particular plant. All right, we are almost done here, and then we're going to auction these guys off. Okay. All right, so that is about as good, I think, as we can get this tree. The apex is still a little bit funky. We need some grafting down in this area as well to fill this space in. This initial branch that was here, it was too thick to bend back down to fill that space in, so I went ahead and removed it. But we can graft down in this area and kind of fill that space in. So with a literati, I would consider this sort of a literati type style. We want the apex to stretch a little bit more, say, than we would on a tree like that, with more of a sort of informal upright style. So it's okay that this kind of stretches up towards the top. This just needs to all fill in back here. We've got, for example, this bud that will fill that space in, but I do want to graft back in this area at some point. So that's about as good, I think, as we can get this tree at this stage. You guys have any last minute questions about this one? Yeah. All right, so it's a little sparse in the back, but we do have some branches strategically placed here that should fill that space in quite nicely. There's no cracking here at all. It's a little bit of tearing here, but we can put some cut paste on that, not a problem at all. As long as it doesn't snap. As long as it doesn't snap, it should be fine. And it's not bleeding at all, so we should be A-okay, right? But let me put a couple pieces of wire in here too, so we can show exactly where the front of this tree is. And where you guys are sitting, I'm sure it looks very stretched up at the top, but when we drop this down and you come up and actually stand at the proper angle, it should look quite nice. There's a lot of movement up there at the top as well. So we'll put that right there. Any other questions about it? What else we got? Oh, sorry. Yes. Absolutely.
So it's pretty quiet on the floor there, questions-wise. So whilst this last couple of minutes here is taking place, turn to the person next to you and just talk a little bit about that demo. What did you learn? What are you taking home from that? What inspires you?
Absolutely nothing. Hold on.
Bjorn, great question here from the front because we were talking with the VTPs. How did you finish off the raffia? How did you end it on the branch?
How did I finish off the raffia? Okay. There are a couple ways to do it. So in the case of this branch, the raffia was long enough for me to get up to an area where we had a bifurcation or a split in the branches. So just like I started the raffia here at the base where it was already knotted and I split that knot or split the two pieces of raffia around that branch and used that knot to hold it in place. When I got up to the very end here, all those loose pieces of raffia, I split them into two groups, wrapped them around that bifurcation in the branch and tied it nice and tight. And I double knotted it there so it doesn't slip off. The other way to tie it off, if we did not have a branch out here or a split like that, where, say for example, we were going to stop it kind of in this area here and there's nothing to tie it off to, what I would do a few wraps further back down the branch is take probably 2 strands of the raffia and actually lay it down the length of the branch, then wrap those remaining pieces around that 4, 5, 6 times. That way when I get to the end, I have a piece or 2 pieces of raffia sticking out that I can then tie that raffia off to and it won't slip out. That's probably a little bit more difficult to visualize than splitting it here at the end and tying it off, but those are 2 easy ways to tie the raffia off. And again, in the case of this branch, the raffia that we applied to it was already relatively long, so I was able to just take one group of raffia, start it here, and go all the way out to the very end. If that raffia had been short, I would have needed to add a secondary group to that to continue it out further on the branch. It's a little bit tricky to visualize just from hearing me talk about it, but we'll see if we can make this work. So, say for example, that first group of raffia stopped right about here. What I would do is take that next group of raffia, go ahead and pull it out here. All right, take that next group of raffia, and we've got the knotted end here. I would lay that on the branch, like so. Put that knot underneath the original group of raffia, wrap that original group around one more time, twist it together, and then continue it further out on the branch. Then at the very end, I'd go back and cut off this knot, so it'd be seamless from the bottom where we started the raffia all the way out to the very tip. It's kind of hard, again, to visualize that at this stage. The advanced course that I have online, it covers exactly how to do that in a lot of detail. So you can really see that. It's all HD up-close video and explains that whole process if you want to see how that works. What else we got? Yes, sir.
The 2 trees that you've done,
Uh-huh.
2 dimensional. Do you find it easy to build a tree that way and then get the depth in, like at the top, like you said, you graft it later?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the tree itself is actually quite 3-dimensional. Both of these are. The only thing that's 2-dimensional is the apex up here. That's pretty typical at this stage, particularly if you don't have much branching to work with. So yes, like I talked about earlier, we'd be grafting into this area, allowing some of these up here, say for example, these 2 buds, this bud here. We wouldn't probably decandle those this year and allow them to elongate and fill that space in. So within a single growing season, we could have these elongated out to here and it would look very 3-dimensional up at the top. That's about as good as we can get it at this stage, just with limited branching. Same with the other tree, exactly. Yep.